A handful of dates are etched into our collective memory, some joyous, others tragic. 20 years ago, September 11th, 2001, became, in President Roosevelt's words after Pearl Harbor, a date which will live in infamy. But while the terrorists imposed their burden of grief and suffering, and while the threat persists today, we can now say, with the perspective of 20 years, that they failed to shake our belief in freedom and democracy. They failed to drive our nations apart, or to cause us to abandon our values or to live in permanent fear. The fact that we are coming together today, in sorrow but also in faith and resolve, demonstrates the failure of terrorism and the strength of the bonds between us. Recent events in Afghanistan only strengthen our determination to remember those who were taken from us, cherish the survivors and those who still grieve, and hold fast to our belief in liberty and democracy, which will always prevail over every foe.
All right, let's stay on the story then, and we bring in, and we're joined, in fact, via Zoom by Professor Farid Esack He. He is a senior researcher at the University of Johannesburg, who happened to actually be in the US at the time of these attacks. A very good afternoon to you, Prof. Long time no see. Good to see you again.
Good afternoon, and thanks for having me.
You're most welcome. Prof, there's no doubt that 9/11 is one of those defining days in history where, if you were old enough, you certainly do remember where you were at the time and what we were doing at that time. More so for someone like you, Prof, since you were actually, I believe, in New York at the time when all of this sort of happened. Take us back to that day, to 9/11. The fears which were, of course, felt, I mean, throughout the world. I was in high school at the time, and I remember, being told that, World War III is coming, and there was just this weird, strange fear, I suppose, that had overwhelmed everyone, and I suppose more so in the US where you were at the time.
That's correct. I was teaching in Manhattan at that time at Union Theological Seminary, which is associated with Columbia University. And I got ready to go to class at about 10 or so in the morning, bumped into a petrified student who asked if I'd heard that the Twin Towers, that one of the Twin Towers, a plane had crashed into it. I'd never heard of the Twin Towers until then. Rushed into the common room where a large number of faculty and students had gathered. And then a number of us went onto the roof to go and look out at the smoke, the screams of fire engines and ambulances all around us. And on the roof, we actually saw the second building catching smoke. We came down and then heard that there was a second flight, and it was then that it really hit people that it was a calculated attack from outside. People in general were horrified, glued to their TV screens, traumatized by the sounds of all these emergency vehicles around them. But at the same time, there were two different kinds of elements that stuck out for me on that particular day. At about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, I ran down quite a number of blocks from 116th Street, and I came up to about 35th Street, and it was on 24th Street where the Twin Towers were actually located.
Yeah.
Two fascinating things I encountered in my run on the very empty streets of Manhattan, other than emergency vehicles. The one was that Starbucks was one of the few places that was still open, and that they were selling bottled water for 4 times more than what their ordinary prices were.
Wow.
And the second one was a group of Christian evangelical people, or wanting to in some ways console people that they thought were feeling bereft, and in other ways trying to convert people in their moments of anguish and so on. It was quite literally a case of, in Afrikaans, die een se dood is die ander se brood, or the one man's meat is, the one man's death is the other man's silver. The other thing that really impressed me about New Yorkers was, despite the ordinarily perceived spirit of individualism, was their ability to cohere, their ability to offer solidarity. There were thousands of people who lined the queues for to donate blood, for example. People were volunteering all over to provide water within a few hours after this event. And one other very significant thing was how many New Yorkers rallied to Afghani-owned restaurants to clearly indicate that, no, we're not going to hold the Afghanis accountable for this. It's not their problem. They're amongst the poorest people in the world. And of course, painfully, within 2-3 days of this event, all of the sense of ordinary people solidarity were marshaled against one of the poorest countries in the world, Afghanistan, and we saw the aftermath of that until a few days ago.
Yeah. Prof, then you talk about these terrorist groupings, and I mean, it was around this time then that we kind of started to hear about Al-Qaeda and terrorist groups linked to them, where they sort of gained notoriety. Looking back now, in retrospect, how should this issue of terrorist organizations have been addressed? I mean, I was listening to Boris Johnson now, who's had a word to say about the 9/11 attacks, and he was saying, with this perspective of 20 years, it's safe to say that they failed. But I find that's disingenuous for him to say that they failed, because the fears are still there, the mistrust. I think that in general, people started to have more fear due to what happened in the US and in New York that day. Although there was this face that was associated to the attacks, but we're still dealing with these particular groupings.
Well, I mean, the only thing that was of any kind of note for me in Boris Johnson's comments was the eloquence of his English. He certainly has a grip on his mother tongue. But other than that, I mean, it was skillfully employed rhetoric to rally people to the same old lost causes. It was the United States, it was Britain, and a number of other. Now it has come out how French cement companies have been funding Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Iraq, even as the French government was combating what it calls local acts of terrorism. So the whole, I don't know, I mean, people are often suggesting that the United States will now have learned, its lessons, but it didn't learn its lessons from Vietnam. In many ways, I think the imperatives that the economic need for war, fueled by the military-industrial complexes, that need is far too urgent, far too compelling for countries to actually learn lessons.
Yeah.
Do bear in mind that although at a superficial glance, we think that it's people who say read the New York Times who make decisions. The real decision makers in the world are people who read the Wall Street Journal. And so politicians can speak, politicians can pontificate, but at the end of the day, politicians are beholden to the financial behind the scenes. And this then means it's not simply a question of a political analysis of what has the United States learned, what have the Pakistanis learned behind the scenes. It's an examination of the larger global forces that have this serious financial wherewithal to push countries' policies and propaganda into one direction or the other. So I don't think that the United States looks good in the eyes of the world, or NATO, or this coalition of terror, really.
Yeah.
But did they succeed or did they not succeed? Well, it depends. If you really bought their propaganda that they went in there to enforce democracy, to take civilized human rights values to those places, then one says, no, they didn't succeed. But if you think that they went in there at the behest of numerous military industrial companies, then they made profits to 2,000-3,000%, if not beyond that, in this last 20 years. So indeed, at a public relations level, it seems like it was all a waste of time. But for those who really matter, no, it was an absolute boom in their coffers.
Yeah.
And while it was a boom in their coffers, the American people, and more so the Afghan people, paid the price in coffins.
All right, Prof, I wish we had more time. Thank you so much for giving us your thoughts on the day, and certainly taking us back to that day. And who better to speak to than someone who actually was on the ground back then 20 years ago. Thank you, Prof. It's always a pleasure to see you. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, that is Professor Farid Esack, who's a senior researcher at the University of Johannesburg, as of course there are global commemorations really of 9/11 today, 20 years on.